You people rock!
Hey, poor! Hey, poor! Hey, poor! You don't have to be poor anymore! Jesus is here!
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude just outside of Redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is busy running around the house. Oh, he's heard his name. Now he's coming over here. Yes. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cat. Get over it. This episode was supposed to feature my conversation with Zandy Anderson, but unfortunately she had a few things come up at the last moment and we weren't able to record this week. We've rescheduled and I'll have that for you in a future episode. Before I go on, I need to take care of some housekeeping, and I have some big-ass thank yous to give out to a shitload of folks, it seems. In 1 week, my GoFundMe campaign has managed to raise enough money to enable me to stay here. I know I sent a thank you to everyone who donated, but let me again express my gratitude to those of you listening who donated or shared my GoFundMe request. I also need to thank Heretic Woman from the Beyond the Trailer Park podcast, who mentioned my plight on her show, as well as the many members of the Thank God I'm Atheist Members Only Lounge on Facebook, and most especially Kirsten and America Darling Curl for their tireless efforts at pimping my request over the past week. Couldn't have done it without them. I have left the page up and raised the goal so that if you want to help me get a car, you can, because if I don't get a car, I will find myself in this situation again, I'm sure. Right now, my after-tax income is $260 a week, with about 70 of that going to bus fare. As you can imagine, it's not terribly easy to live off of that. I do have some other good news in that I had a job interview with a place here in town. If I get the job, it would start out at about what I'm making now. It's not related to metalworking, so that's a bit of a bummer for me, but I might be able to shave off an hour or so of the time I'm currently spending going to and from work if I got the job. I won't know until sometime next week if I've got the job or not. I also need to thank Suzanne from Sweden for her donation to help keep a roof over my head, and she also joins the Cat Food Breath Club of Patreon supporters. George has become a Patreon supporter at the $2 level. Henry, Daniel, Cecilia, and Alan have all joined at the $1 level. That means I'm bringing in $25 per episode, which for a podcast as small as this one is astounding. As I said on the last episode, a typical podcast, regardless of size, can expect about 1% of its listeners to actually support it financially. I'm now well above that level, which speaks volumes to your generosity, and I cannot thank you enough for that. And the less I have to worry about keeping the lights on in this place, the more time I have to think about things to improve the show. Oh, and yes, before I forget, America will be on the show more often, and I'm working on lining up a few other guests in the near future. I think that's all the housekeeping stuff I need to go over, so let me get to the subject of Trump's vice presidential pick of Indiana Governor Mike Pence. I realize that probably nobody who listens to this podcast is planning on voting for Trump, but I want to make sure that everybody knows exactly what kind of shitbag Pence is. He, of course, signed into law a controversial religious freedom bill in Indiana that made it legal to discriminate against people in the LGBT community if your God told you so. This promptly blew up in his face, and the state was forced to modify the law to explicitly prohibit such discrimination. That, however, is not the worst of his actions. One of his actions, namely defunding Planned Parenthood, is why I wanted to have Zandy on, since she does so much work in the area of women's health issues, so she knows far better than I the kind of impact this can have. I'll wait until she's on to discuss that in detail, but I do want to mention that one of the results of this has been an explosion of HIV cases in Indiana. Seems that if you take away free disease testing and condoms, people tend to contract diseases in larger numbers. He also, temporarily, stopped needle exchange programs, so that didn't help things either. Those things are bad enough, but when I started digging into his background, I found shit which is just as bad. There's no way I can go over all of it, so I'll refer you to his Wikipedia entry if you want a larger perspective on the guy, but allow me to hit some of the highlights of the things he's either done or pushed for when he was a congressman from 2000 to 2012. As a member of the House of Representatives, he belonged to the Tea Party caucus. He tried to defund Planned Parenthood in 2007. He co-sponsored a bill which would have limited citizenship to children born to at least one parent who is a citizen, immigrants living permanently in the U.S., or non-citizens performing active service in the U.S. military. He's a big fan of the Citizens United decision. He's in favor of the gold standard. This just shows his ignorance of economics. It wasn't until the U.S. went off the gold standard that our economy began to really grow, and very few economists think that returning to the gold standard would be a good idea. The logic, if you could call it that, behind the gold standard is that this somehow limits inflation, when you point out that this also limits the ability of the economy to grow. Gold buggers, as folks who are behind the gold standard are often called, will say that you can get around this by going to what they call a fractional gold standard, which really isn't anything significantly different than what we have now. The idea of a fractional gold standard is that it allows you to change the value of a dollar in relation to gold. So, if, for example, you have a dollar which is equal to 1 ounce of gold, and you want to increase the amount of money in circulation, you say that the dollar is now only worth half an ounce of gold. The only difference between that and printing more money to increase the supply of money is that with a fractional gold standard, you can take your dollar to the bank and demand that they give you some gold in exchange for it. Unlike today, where if you want gold in exchange for your dollar, you have to go to a merchant and buy gold from them. In effect, they want to take the distribution of gold from the private sector and socialize it. Which is funny, because they're all opposed to socialism. The folks that I know who want to do this are all prepper nutters who think that the economy is going to collapse any day now, and everybody's going to go back to gold and silver for money. The problem with this is that it's such an alien medium of exchange for everyone that there's really no way for it to work. I know how to tell if a coin is made from real silver, but I have no idea how to tell if one's made from real gold. And if you look at the buy gold ads, they're selling what they call gold dollars, which have a face value of $1 or more, but retail for hundreds or thousands of dollars. What happens in a collapsed economic society when someone uses one of those to buy, say, a dozen eggs? If the face value of a coin that you paid $200 for is $1, and the farmer you're talking to is selling eggs for $1, are you going to give him that coin and expect him to pay you $199 in change? Or are you going to happily pay $200 in old-style money for a dozen eggs? Money, regardless if it's paper currency or precious metals, is a human construct. And because of that, it's going to be hard for us to shed our old ways of thinking about it. We still talk about dialing a phone, even though rotary phones probably haven't been made in decades. The guy who has that gold coin is going to think of it as being worth $200. The guy with the eggs is probably going to think of it as having a face value of $1. Oops. Pence opposed the auto bailout. Now, as a car guy, I know better than most people that the U.S. auto industry has had a number of issues with things like quality, and I wasn't at all surprised that they found themselves in financial trouble when the economy collapsed. But letting GM and Chrysler go under wouldn't have saved the government any money. Not only would the unemployed workers at GM and Chrysler needed things like food stamps and other forms of welfare, but the people who worked for their various suppliers also would have needed those things as well, since their jobs would be going away once their biggest customers went away. Sure, eventually the surviving automakers and suppliers would have expanded to replace those jobs. But how long would that take? In the meantime, you've got millions of people who are either unemployed or underemployed, which is a classic recipe for social unrest. And to paraphrase Bill Murray in Ghostbusters, Lenny, you will have saved the jobs of millions of registered voters. Now, I will say that Pence does have one thing in his favor, and that is he was opposed to the No Child Left Behind Act, which has not been shown to improve educational standards in the U.S. In fact, they've all but gutted it because of the kind of failure it's turned out to be. Pence also thinks global warming is a myth. He loves Gitmo and doesn't see any reason to close it. He opposed Obamacare and compared it to 9/11. And while he later apologized for those remarks, the fact that he was willing to make such a rabid comparison tells me that he's an extremist. He wants to expand the Patriot Act because small government doesn't apply to the concept of spying on citizens. He opposed most attempts at immigration reform, including those proposed by the members of his own party. He opposes stem cell research, which means he's in favor of letting people die needlessly, despite calling himself pro-life. Pence wants creationism taught in schools, and while he doesn't seem to be quite as crazy as Hambone, as I couldn't find anything of him saying that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, that's not much of a selling point in his favor. He seems to think that there's no proof of evolution, despite the growth of drug-resistant bacteria, which should be seen as undeniable evidence of evolution. He's in favor of abstinence-only education, and we all know how well that doesn't work. Pence has opposed efforts to regulate tobacco and denies smoking causes health problems, even though he says it's not good for you. His state has one of the highest percentages of smokers in the country. For those of you who don't live in the American South, let me explain to you why this is so remarkable. Most tobacco in the U.S. is grown in the South, in places like Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky, where they're huge cash crops. In some of those states, they were the largest legal cash crop until fairly recently. The largest cash crop in pretty much every state in the U.S. is weed, which is only legal in 4. Now, because of that, states in the South rigorously opposed any kinds of smoking regulation for the longest time. When I moved here in the late 80s, you could literally smoke anywhere you wanted to, even in hospitals. Then, in the mid-90s, they began to restrict where the places you could smoke, but there's still, up until less than 10 years ago, there were still smoking and non-smoking sections in restaurants. There was no law that prohibited you from smoking at work. Those didn't come into place until around 2008, which, for a lot of you, I know is surprising because you've had smoking bans for far longer. But even so, we're still far more relaxed in our laws than many other states. I can smoke on the shop floor at work if I want. Now, that should give us a higher smoking rate than just about anywhere else in the country. Indiana's smoking rate is higher than ours. They're ranked 5th in the nation. Tennessee is 13th. And our annual tobacco crop in Tennessee is worth about $76 million a year, while Indiana's is only worth about $15 million. So we have a huge economic incentive to be very pro-smoking in this state and keep as many people smoking as possible, yet we have fewer smokers here on a percentage-wise, not population-wise, but a percentage-wise, than they do in Indiana. Something to think about. Pence also supported every trade deal in Congress except those which offered to help American workers who lost their jobs due to expanded trade. I'm not going to get into the debate over if the TPP is a good thing or not. I just want to point out that every time the government tries to fund programs to retrain people who've lost their jobs due to them being shipped overseas, the Republicans block it. Pence is no exception to this. And really, if you want the general public to sign off on a trade deal, then you need to promise them and keep your promise that if they do lose their job because of it, they will be able to replace it with a job that pays what they were making before. Pence has opposed all efforts to protect the rights of gays and wants them barred from military service because it destroys unit cohesion, in his words. I find this particularly funny since Pence has a degree in history. A historian should know that 2 of the fiercest armies in the ancient world were the Greek and Roman armies, and neither society had a big hang-up about homosexuality. Rome, I should also point out, didn't fall when it was a pagan nation, but when it was a Christian nation. As governor, his state has had one of the slowest growing economies in the country. He's blocked efforts to raise the minimum wage. He's cut tens of millions of dollars from education, public assistance programs, and the prison system, while he also pushed for increased penalties on drug crimes. He's legalized people having guns on school property because, the only thing that can stop a mass shooting is a bunch of people jumping up and firing their weapons at somebody who is carrying a gun. He signed a bill into law barring women from having an abortion if the fetus had severe birth defects. So even though your baby is going to be stillborn, die shortly after it leaves the mother's womb, or be subjected to a miserable life in pain and become a ward of the state if you can't afford the massive medical bills each year to keep the child alive, you have to carry it to term. Now, this law has been effectively ruled unconstitutional by a recent Supreme Court decision, so women aren't going to have to endure this shit. But if Trump manages to win the White House, you can bet Pence is going to be fighting to ban all abortions. He's already said as much with his recent comments. That, by the way, is the short list. The 3 positives I can say about him is that none of the legislation he proposed while he was in Congress ever became law. He opposed No Child Left Behind and supported reforms to pork barrel spending. Everybody used to say that as vice president, Sarah Palin was dangerous since she didn't understand anything. Pence is dangerous for the reason that he does understand how government works. He'll also be dealing with a Republican-controlled Congress. I can't really see how Trump could win the White House while the Dems manage to take control of Congress. It could happen, but the kind of scenario needed for that seems unlikely. Okay, 2 quick pieces of related news, and then I'm going to have to shuffle off for the evening. My apologies for this being a shorter episode, but as I explained, with Zandy not being able to do it, it kind of left me a little unprepared. This first piece comes from Reuters.com. Florida governor criticizes Washington for lagging in Zika fight. Florida Republican Governor Rick Scott on Sunday accused the federal government of lagging in providing assistance to combat the spread of the Zika virus in a Miami area neighborhood, the site of the first U.S. transmission of the virus. Scott was speaking on NBC's Meet the Press about the neighborhood of Wynwood, where crews began aerial spraying on Thursday to kill virus-carrying mosquitoes. Zika can cause microcephaly, a rare but devastating birth defect. Now, he's blaming the government, as in Congress and the president, for not acting. Well, if you have followed any of the patterns when it comes to disasters and crises in America since the Republicans began to dominate Congress after about 2004, whenever there's a big disaster, the Republicans often vote against sending aid to help those people in the affected areas, unless that member of Congress just happens to come from that area. So we now have the situation where Zika is spreading in Florida, and because the state lacks the resources, partially because Scott, who is also a Republican, has, cut government services and taxes, so the state government doesn't have the resources to properly handle this on its own. They're having to reach out to the federal government for help. You're going to wind up with a disease that'll spread beyond this area. So, and this is just like, in many ways, HIV when it first got noticed. It first appeared in the States. They've now they've gone back and re-examined old tissue samples and found that some of the first cases in the U.S. were in the 50s, but it didn't actually begin to get noticed as a distinct disease until the early 70s, when doctors started noticing people dying of tropical diseases, even though these people had been nowhere near the tropics. And then, of course, HIV became identified in the 80s. Well, by this point, it had exploded. It exploded in the gay population, and heterosexuals were also being infected by it because it was in the blood supply. That's how Ryan White got it. If we had a concerted government program to deal with Zika, we could prevent it from spreading out of this area in Florida, and I believe it's shown up in a couple other states as well. And not only does it cause microcephaly in women who are pregnant, and they don't even have to have the disease, be suffering from the disease for it to be a problem. Studies have shown that that women, months after they've recovered from Zika, if they get pregnant, often have children with microcephaly. So it's not just a thing where, well, make sure you're not pregnant when you get it and you'll be fine. It's no, actually you probably don't want to get it at all. And in elderly or people with compromised immune systems because of organ transplants or diseases like HIV and a few others, it can be fatal. And as the story in the Daily Kos points out, the Trump campaign not really concerned with Zika either. From their article, Juan Fuel, Trump's vice chairman for Miami-Dade County, is betting most voters don't care enough about Zika to warrant Trump's attention. We have bigger mosquitoes to squash than Zika, like ISIS, the national debt, Iraq, and Afghanistan, Fuel said, pounding his fist on the bar during an interview at a Trump party in downtown Miami. We have a wall to build to keep the illegals out. We have so many other issues that are more important than this. He called Clinton sophomoric for taking on such an insignificant issue. Zika is not going to be restricted to just Florida and other warm states. If it can live in mosquitoes, it'll make its way to every state in America that has mosquitoes, which is all of them. Now, one solution that everybody should be looking at this time, and they're not going to, is let's just wipe out mosquitoes. And when I say wipe out mosquitoes, I mean there are 200 species of mosquitoes out there that bite humans out of the 3,000 species of mosquitoes. We could easily cause those 200 species to go extinct with no damage to the environment. Mosquitoes are so nutritionally deficient that even animals that eat them that's not their primary source of food. So, and that's not me saying this. This is E.O. Wilson, one of the greatest biologists out there, who says this along with many, many, many others. I mean, he says wipe them out. And if we did that, we would stop not only the spread of Zika, we would stop the spread of malaria, yellow fever, a whole host of diseases that are currently spread primarily, if not exclusively, by mosquitoes. But, you know, that's not as sexy as blowing up ISIS, so they're not going to do it. Now, it'd be funny if Florida applied the same logic to Trump's wall as Trump and the other Republicans are applying to Zika. Well, it's only in Florida, so fuck those guys. We don't really care. Florida, there's no point in building a wall there, and because there's not people coming over from Mexico, and most of the immigrants who show up in Florida are Cubans, and we have the dry foot, wet foot policy when it comes to Cubans, which means if they touch American soil, they're automatically granted asylum, but if they're caught at sea, they're turned back. And given the large Cuban population, anyone suggesting in Florida that we change the policy regarding people leaving Cuba for the States, that would not go over very well. Okay, again, I apologize for this being a short episode, but as I said, I'm sure you can understand. I will have Zandy on soon so we can talk about some of the things with Pence in more detail. We're going to try to record the episode later on this week if we can, and I'm able to get it edited. I will post it this week. For those of you who are Patreon subscribers, that will be a free episode if I get it up. Otherwise, it'll go up not this weekend, but the following weekend, in all probability. And because next episode will be the beginning of Second Esdras. I'm not sure if I'm going to have a guest helping me read that or not. I have to see how everything plays out this week. I don't remember if I mentioned it at the beginning of this episode or not, but I had an interview earlier this week, or last week, with a company, and they're supposed to call me sometime next week and schedule a second interview with me. So hopefully I get that job. And that will determine when I can do some of this stuff. And basically everything's up in the air until I hear from them. And once again, I want to thank everybody for their support, helping me keep my roof. And for all those of you who've become Patreon subscribers, you do not know how much this means to me and how much you're helping me out with this. You really don't. If it wasn't for you guys, I'd be out of here. There's just no other way to say it. I'd be homeless, and I don't know what would happen with Fuzznuts and Houdini. So, I thank you again, and you know, you guys, I need to point this out. You guys were so good at doing this. I didn't even have a chance to set up the Modest Needs campaign because I haven't talked to my landlord yet about everything. So, Of course, he could say, well, I don't even care if you've got the money, you're out of here. But as long as he's willing to take the money and let me live here, then I'm good. I will keep everybody posted on this. So, once again, thank you, and I will talk to you next week.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fosnuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.